The Galactic Empire's forces loomed over the battlefield, their shimmering silver armor glinting under the pale sunlight of the desolate planet. They moved with the calculated precision of a machine, their advanced hover tanks humming softly as they levitated above the ground. From their vantage point on the ridge, Imperial officers surveyed the human defenses below with barely concealed amusement. Clustered in makeshift trenches, the humans looked ragged and desperate. Their equipment was ancient by any standard, cobbled together from scraps of older wars. Most laughable of all were the tubes they seemed to be setting up along their defensive line, relics of an era long past. One of the officers, a tall figure with iridescent skin, let out a bark of laughter. "Do you see that?" he sneered, pointing at one of the crude contraptions. "They call that a weapon. We'll be done here before the sun's set." Another officer joined in the derision. "It's almost quaint, isn't it? Watching them cling to their scraps of history like it will save them. This is why they've always been beneath us. No innovation, no vision." The troops stationed below seemed to share their officers' disdain. The rank-and-file soldiers of the Empire, towering beings with bioengineered physiques, stood in relaxed formations, some even casually conversing as they awaited orders. They had no reason to fear. The humans had been thoroughly outmatched in every engagement so far, their resistance little more than a nuisance. Humanity's outdated approach was a joke, and the Empire's commanders were enjoying the punchline. Their war machines, shielded by energy fields that could withstand anything short of a nuclear blast, had decimated Earth's forces in previous skirmishes. Human weapons were antiquated, incapable of penetrating their defenses. This battle, they believed, would be no different. "Primitive tools for a primitive species," an officer remarked, scanning the battlefield with a pair of augmented oculars. "It's a pity, really. They could have surrendered and saved themselves this embarrassment." But the humans did not surrender. Quietly, methodically, they prepared their defenses. The trenches buzzed with activity as soldiers adjusted the positions of the ancient tubes, loading them with what appeared to be crude projectiles. Their faces were stoic, unreadable. Among them, a grizzled commander stood silently, observing the enemy lines. His face bore the hardened look of someone who had lived through countless battles, yet there was something else in his expression, something the Empire's officers failed to notice. The first mortar fired. The arc of the projectile was slow, almost comical, as it rose high into the air. The Empire's troops watched it with bemusement, their amusement growing as it descended. "This is their grand counterattack," one officer quipped. "A rock in a canister? Shall we laugh now or—" The projectile landed squarely on a hover tank, detonating in a deafening explosion that sent shockwaves rippling across the battlefield. The tank's shield flickered for a brief moment before failing entirely, its armored hull torn apart by the force of the blast. Flames erupted from the wreckage, and the soldiers nearby were thrown to the ground. The laughter stopped. What was that?" The officer's voice was no longer mocking. His augmented oculus zoomed in on the impact site, revealing the smoldering remains of one of their most advanced vehicles. Before anyone could answer, another mortar fired. This one struck the ground near a cluster of troops, shrapnel tearing through their ranks. The Empire's forces, so sure of their invincibility moments ago, were now scrambling to make sense of what was happening. This is impossible," one soldier cried out, his voice tinged with panic. "Our shields." "They're useless," another interrupted, his tone incredulous. "These aren't energy weapons. They're kinetic," the officer finished, realization dawning on him. From the trenches, the humans continued their assault, firing mortars with precision. Each impact sowed chaos among the alien ranks, the explosions ripping through their advanced armor and exposing the fatal flaw in their over-reliance on energy-based defenses. The Empire's mockery had turned to disbelief, their overconfidence shattered by the very thing they had dismissed. The sound of the mortars echoed across the battlefield, a stark reminder that sometimes simplicity could triumph over sophistication. The first explosion echoed across the battlefield, reverberating through the Imperial ranks like a thunderclap. Alien soldiers, once relaxed and confident, froze in place as the smoking remains of the hover tanks sank into the scorched earth. The brilliance of their shields had failed to stop the crude, arcing projectile. For the first time in decades of warfare, the Empire's forces experienced a moment of genuine fear. Another mortar launched, its trajectory a slow, deliberate arc. Imperial soldiers scrambled, shouting commands in a dozen alien dialects. The projectile struck the ground near a cluster of infantry, its explosion releasing a torrent of shrapnel that tore through their ranks. The sight was surreal. Bodies fell, armor cracked, and screams pierced the air as the shrapnel wreaked havoc. "They're firing solid projectiles," an officer shouted, disbelief lacing his words. "This technology is ancient. It shouldn't be working against us." A squad leader activated his communicator, demanding an immediate recalibration of the unit's shields. But the engineers were helpless. Kinetic energy wasn't accounted for in the shield design, came the response. "We don't have a countermeasure. Adapt immediately." Adaptation was easier said than done. Mortar rounds continued to rain down, the steady rhythmic sound of each launch driving panic through the Imperial lines. Soldiers darted for cover that didn't exist, their formations breaking apart. Hover tanks attempted to retreat, but their slow speed made them easy targets. The second vehicle exploded just as spectacularly as the first, its debris raining down on the troops below. The human strategy became clear. Their trenches, hastily constructed, were perfectly positioned to obscure their mortars from view. Each weapon was hidden behind natural rock formations or buried under camouflaged netting. The Imperial scanners, designed to detect advanced weaponry, failed to register the mortars entirely. "We can't see their positions," an officer bellowed into his communicator. "Their technology is too primitive to register on our systems," came the reply. "Too primitive?" The officer's voice cracked, fury mixing with frustration. "Then why are my troops being slaughtered?" Humans fired another volley. This time, the rounds targeted an incoming wave of Imperial drones. The first drone detonated mid-air as shrapnel ripped through its fragile frame, causing it to spiral into the ranks below. More drones followed, each meeting the same fate. The Empire's most sophisticated reconnaissance and assault tools were being obliterated by weapons forged centuries ago. The Empire's commanders tried to adapt. Orders were issued for a full aerial assault. High-speed skimmers rose into the air, their plasma cannons primed to eliminate the human positions. But the humans had anticipated this move. They shifted their focus, launching mortars designed for anti-air combat. The explosions were precise, tearing through the skimmers' fragile underbellies and sending them plummeting into the ground. "This wasn't supposed to happen," an officer muttered, watching as yet another skimmer disintegrated. His earlier arrogance had dissolved into cold disbelief. They were supposed to be outmatched, overwhelmed. The humans remained silent in their trenches, their movements efficient and calculated. Each mortar fired with the same unerring precision, each explosion throwing the Imperial forces into deeper disarray. Every attempt by the Empire to counter their tactics was met with failure. Advanced technology became a liability as the Empire struggled to adapt to an enemy they had dismissed as inferior. "They've turned their weakness into a strength," one officer said bitterly, his gaze fixed on the battlefield. "These weapons, they're too simple to predict, too primitive to counter. How did we not see this coming?" But it wasn't just the weapons. It was the humans themselves, their resilience, their creativity, their refusal to fight on the Empire's terms. Every explosion was a statement, every casualty a reminder that arrogance could be fatal. The Empire's troops were unraveling, their once flawless formations now reduced to chaos. By the time the Imperial commanders began ordering a retreat, the humans had already shifted their focus. Mortar fire targeted escape routes, blocking off the paths for hover tanks and infantry alike. The battlefield had become a killing ground, each explosion echoing with the sound of the Empire's humiliation. In their desperation, the Empire's forces fired indiscriminately at the human trenches, hoping to overwhelm them with sheer firepower. Plasma bolts rained down, carving deep scars into the earth. But the humans had prepared for this too. Their mortars were mobile, repositioned with each volley to ensure they could never be pinpointed. The final mortar of the volley struck a command post, its explosion sending a plume of smoke and debris into the sky. The Empire's high-ranking officers, who had spent the battle mocking humanity's tactics, were silenced in an instant. The once pristine battlefield, where the Empire had expected to display its dominance, was now littered with wreckage, blood, and the shattered remains of their pride. The humans did not cheer. They did not jeer. They simply continued firing, their methodical efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos they had unleashed. The Imperial forces, reeling from the relentless assault, scrambled to regroup. Their once imposing lines were in tatters, scattered across the battlefield in disarray. The alien commanders barked orders, their voices cracking under the strain of panic. Drones buzzed overhead, frantically searching for the source of the human mortars, but the scans yielded nothing. The simplicity of the weapons rendered them invisible to the advanced detection systems. The Empire launched wave after wave of reinforcements. Heavily armed walkers, towering machines bristling with plasma cannons, stomped onto the battlefield, their operators confident in their ability to turn the tide. Behind them, swarms of sleek drones formed an ominous vanguard, their energy weapons primed for destruction. The skies darkened as squadrons of Imperial skimmers swooped in, ready to rain plasma upon the human positions. The first volley from the walkers sent tremors through the earth, each plasma shot carving fiery craters into the ground. The Empire's technological prowess seemed insurmountable, a demonstration of power that had crushed countless enemies before. But the humans were undeterred. Mortar shells began to fall, targeting the joints and exposed vulnerabilities of the walkers. A round struck the lead walker square in its leg joint, and with a deafening groan of metal, the towering machine collapsed. It crushed several soldiers beneath its bulk, its plasma cannons sputtering uselessly as flames consumed it. More mortars followed, precise and unrelenting, each one exploiting the structural weaknesses of the Empire's most imposing weapons. "They're focusing fire," an Imperial officer shouted. "How are they so accurate with such primitive technology?" The answer lay in the human strategy. They had spent weeks studying the Empire's movements, noting patterns, weaknesses, and points of failure. Each mortar round was fired with intent, targeting critical systems that even the most advanced defenses couldn't protect. The walkers, for all their might, were falling one by one. The drones, meant to provide air superiority, fared no better. Human mortars exploded in their midst, filling the sky with shrapnel that tore through their delicate mechanisms. Those that evaded destruction found themselves unable to locate the mortars, their sensors overwhelmed by the humans' crude but effective camouflage. Even the skimmers, sleek and deadly, were forced into desperate maneuvers to avoid the constant barrage. One by one, they succumbed to well-placed mortar rounds, spiraling to the ground in fiery trails. The battlefield became a graveyard of Imperial machines, their shattered forms a testament to the power of human ingenuity. The Empire's troops were losing morale. Soldiers who once marched with confidence now hesitated, their eyes darting nervously toward the horizon. The sound of the mortars, a steady, unrelenting rhythm, had become a source of dread. Each launch was a promise of destruction, each explosion a reminder of their vulnerability. "We can't hold this position," one officer admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "If we stay, they'll pick us apart." The retreat began, but it was chaotic and uncoordinated. Imperial commanders, desperate to salvage what they could, issued conflicting orders. Hover tanks attempted to reverse course, only to find their paths blocked by the wreckage of their own machines. Infantry units scattered, abandoning formation in a frantic bid for survival. The humans seized the opportunity, adjusting their strategy on the fly. Mortar teams shifted their focus to the retreating forces, cutting off escape routes and trapping the Empire's soldiers in a tightening noose. The aliens who had once mocked human technology were now fleeing for their lives, their superior weaponry rendered useless against a foe they had dismissed as primitive. For the Empire, the humiliation was total. Their most advanced machines lay in ruins, their troops demoralized and broken. The battlefield, which they had expected to dominate, was now a scene of chaos and defeat. Yet the humans pressed on, relentless in their pursuit. Their resolve was unshaken, their tactics ruthless. Each mortar round fired was a declaration, a statement that humanity would not be conquered so easily. The alien commanders, watching from the safety of their rear positions, could only stare in disbelief. Their forces had faced countless adversaries, many of them far more advanced than humanity. Yet here they were, undone by weapons that should have been obsolete centuries ago. How? One commander muttered, his voice hollow. How did they do this? How did we not see this coming? Another officer, his uniform smeared with dirt and blood, shook his head. We underestimated them, he said. We thought their simplicity was a weakness. But it was their greatest strength. As the last of the retreating forces disappeared over the horizon, the battlefield fell silent. Smoke and ash filled the air, mingling with the acrid stench of burning metal. The Empire had been defeated, not by superior firepower, but by the unyielding will and ingenuity of humanity. For the humans, there was no celebration. They worked quickly and efficiently, gathering what remained of their mortars and preparing for the battles yet to come. Their victory was hard-earned, but they knew it was only a small step in a much larger war. The mortars, those ancient, overlooked weapons, stood as symbols of defiance. Against all odds, they had turned the tide of battle, proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity could adapt, endure, and triumph. The battlefield lay in grim silence, the echoes of explosions replaced by the crackle of burning wreckage. Smoke hung heavy in the air, a shroud over the shattered remnants of what the Galactic Empire once believed to be an unassailable force. Twisted metal and scorched bodies littered the landscape, a stark testament to the price of arrogance. The humans moved quietly among the carnage, their steps deliberate, their expressions unreadable. A commander stood at the edge of the trenches, his weathered face streaked with dirt and sweat. His eyes scanned the scene before him, taking in the devastation they had wrought. Victory carried no exultation, only a somber acknowledgement of survival. The soldiers around him worked efficiently, collecting the remaining mortar shells and disassembling the launchers. Each action was purposeful. They knew this was only a reprieve, not an end. Far above, in the safety of their command ships, the Empire's high-ranking officials reviewed the battle's outcome. The silence in the war room was deafening as holographic projections replayed the destruction. Officers stared, their disbelief etched into every feature. For all their technological superiority, their troops had been decimated by weapons that didn't even register on their tactical models. This wasn't supposed to happen, one of them said, breaking the silence. His voice was tinged with equal parts confusion and anger. Our forces were invincible. Shields impenetrable. How did they? Another cut him off, her tone colder, more analytical. They exploited a blind spot. We designed our defenses for advanced threats, energy weapons, and orbital strikes. These humans, they used something no longer considered a threat. They turned our own progress against us. The realization was bitter. The Empire had evolved beyond the need for simplicity, dismissing anything not driven by advanced technology as primitive. That oversight had cost them an entire battalion and, worse, their reputation. They'll spread this story, an officer muttered, his fists clenched. They'll use it to rally others, to inspire rebellion. And he was right. News of the humans' victory would travel far, igniting hope in the hearts of countless oppressed worlds. The Empire's image, once untouchable, was now marred by the knowledge that they were not as invincible as they claimed. On the ground, the humans had already begun their preparations for the next battle. Mortars were cleaned and packed away, every shell accounted for. They left nothing behind, no trace of their strategy for the Empire to dissect. This victory was theirs, but they knew it wouldn't end here. A young soldier approached the commander, his face pale but resolute. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked, his voice steady despite the weight of the question. The commander nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "They will. But next time, they won't underestimate us." The soldier frowned, his fingers tightening around the strap of his rifle. "And when they come with something new, Something we haven't seen? A faint smile crossed the commander's lips, though it carried no warmth. Then we'll do what we've always done. Adapt. Improvise. Survive. In the Empire's war rooms, the debrief continued. Plans were already being drafted for retaliation. New algorithms would be written to account for kinetic weaponry, shields recalibrated to deflect projectiles. The Empire's vast resources ensured they could recover quickly, at least in theory. But the cracks in their confidence ran deep. What if it's not just the weapons? One officer asked, his voice barely audible. What if it's the humans themselves? Their unpredictability. Their refusal to play by our rules. The room fell silent again, the question lingering in the air. No one had an answer. Back on the battlefield, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the ruins. The humans moved as a single determined force, their work precise and unhurried. There was no room for celebration, no speeches or cheers. Each soldier knew the gravity of what they had accomplished, but also the enormity of what lay ahead. One soldier paused, his gaze falling on the wreckage of an Imperial hover tank. He knelt beside it, running his hand over the jagged metal. A faint chuckle escaped him as he stood, turning to his comrades. They thought they had us beat with all this fancy tech, he said, shaking his head. Guess they didn't count on good old-fashioned explosives. His words drew a few weary smiles, but the humor was short-lived. They all knew this victory was a message, not just to the Empire, but to themselves. They could fight. They could win. And no matter how outmatched they seemed, they would always find a way to level the playing field. As the last of the mortars was secured and the soldiers began their march back to base, the commander lingered for a moment longer. His eyes traveled across the battlefield, taking in the wreckage one final time. They'll come back, he murmured to himself. And we'll be ready. The Empire's defeat was a wound that would take time to heal, but it was more than that. It was a warning. A reminder that the underestimated often had the most to prove, and that ingenuity, resourcefulness, and determination could rival even the most advanced technology. In the distance, the sound of footsteps faded into the growing night, leaving the battlefield empty save for the lingering remnants of smoke and fire. The humans had left their mark, and the galaxy would never forget it.